Okay, so thank you. Welcome. Glad you all could join us today to hear more about intimate subjects. I am just going to go ahead and briefly introduce our participants today, and then I'm going to turn it over to Julia to get started with some comments about the book. Um, so, um, Today we will be hearing from Simeon Koole, who is a historian of modern Britain and its global entanglements at the University of Bristol. He specializes in the history of the senses and sexuality and works at the intersection of queer studies, the history of science, phenomenology, and global history. His book, which we'll hear more about today, Intimate Subjects, Touch and Tangibility in Britain's Cerebral Age, was published by Chicago University Press in 2024. And his next book examines the bodily and affective practices of world making in London's docklands at the height of late 19th and early 20th century globalization. So welcome, Sim. And he'll be joined today in conversation by Julia Laite, who is professor of history at Birkbeck, University of London. She researches and teaches on the history of gender, crime, and migration in the 19th and 20th century British world. Her most recent book, The Disappearance of Lydia Harvey, won the Golden Dagger for nonfiction from the Crime Writers Association. And her new project will be a historical biography of Shaunawandit, an Indigenous woman in colonial Newfoundland. So I hope you both join me in welcoming both of our guests, and then I'll turn it over to Julia to get started.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And it's so nice to see so many familiar names, although there are no faces. So I'm just going to pretend I'm having a chat with Sim. And you guys can all listen in. But it's really lovely to see so many names I recognize. Hello, everyone. So thank you to the NACBS for hosting this launch, and thanks to Sim for writing such a wonderful, and everybody says thought-provoking as a sort of descriptor of a book. But boy, is this one ever truly and utterly thought-provoking. And I want to start, I think, by reflecting a little on the irony or perhaps the aptness of having this meeting online and of me having read this as an ebook, because I had this big plan to go to the library and cuddle up with the book. And then I discovered that the Cambridge Library copy is only in electronic format. So I had to read it online. And I've been feeling more and more that digitized books are rather a hindrance to me, however convenient and instant they are. Not least because I have vision problems, and by the end of the day of screen reading, I feel the light like an assault on my eyes, kind of pressing into my optic nerve and adding a tender tension, and that word tender comes from the book, to every word I read. That is to say, reading this book, of all books, in ebook form really crystallized my thoughts on ebooks. And as I read, I longed for the library. I thought, what are my hands doing when they turn a page? What does the embodied experience of holding a book, of curling a body around it, add or take away? What do I touch? Who do I touch or avoid touching when I'm in the library tea room? What happens in my mind and to the words I'm reading as I run my fingertips over the wood of an old reading room desk or the smooth formica of a new one? And how do all of these sensory experiences of touch create a constant, reverberating line of interaction with me and the world and the stuff in the book? How does that affect how I read and write history? Like I said, thought-provoking. So this is just one of the many thoughts that this provoked. And I'm immensely grateful that Sim has written a book that has helped me to think in more nuanced, critical, and profound ways about all of this. In the past, of course, it is a history book after all, but also in the present. The history of touch, Simeon writes, reveals transformations in what it meant to be a body over the last 2 centuries. This book begins in Liverpool Street Station in the early 20th century with one human, the imagined you, in a sea of humans, navigating a fast, full, and tactile world full of new and changing rules about how one bees a body. Then we meet Henry Head, a lovelorn neurologist, who severed his own radial and cutaneous nerves to test what sensation he would lose and the way in which the sensation would be regained over time. And as an aside, I recently majorly injured my median nerve on a canoe trip in July, and I still don't have the feeling back in my thumb. So reading about Henry Head doing this on purpose was rather alarming to me because it's not something I would recommend. Anyway, self-experiment is not, or is at least only part of, the point of this chapter. Sim beautifully sets Head's efforts to understand the feeling of the touch in the hand alongside the feelings of touching his lover, Ruth Mayhew's hand. And through their correspondence reveals how much these two seemingly far apart experiments in neurology and in love have to do with each other and have to do with the ethereal subject of Sim's investigations, touch. Something so pervasive, so fundamental, so normal and normalized that we often fail to see it or sense it at all as a category of historical analysis. But if you've read this book, you will no longer be able to ignore touch or forget it about it. So from our neurologist with his severed nerves, we turn to the complex history of training blind children to use touch as a substitute or a supplement for vision, and the way in which this reshaped conversations about ability and disability in the early 20th century. Sim writes, quote, "Over the first half of the 20th century, the history of touch and blindness traced an equally fraught political one of the shifting construction and deconstruction of the able-bodied liberal subject and the disabled other against which it was defined. That is, until blind people themselves began challenging this binary and articulating disability as produced by the world's shortcomings, not their own." The next chapter, I'm flying through. There's so much more in here, folks. But 7 to 10 minutes is a lot, is not a lot, I should say, to be able to cover all of the different threads that are explored in this wonderful book. So the next chapter opens with a murder in a tube station and ponders through this case and other stories the way that the modern commuter shaped and was shaped by these new forms of transport, these underground trains with their, quote, confined indeterminacy, producing fraught moments of unwanted touch and uncanny moments of intimacy. It was a place where, quote, personal space was not owned, but practiced, not constant, but specific, in turn reshaping the delineation of the body itself in relation to other bodies. The space of the tube carriage was also shaped by bigger questions about labor, profit, and transport. And this is one of my favorite things about the book, the way that it toggles between the brush of fingers, the sort of most sort of briefest of touches, to the immensity of globalization, capitalism, modernity, all kind of managed to be stitched together in it. And as someone who routinely travels on unstaffed trains, trapped in a hurtling tube with other strangers, I was especially drawn to this line, quote, "No longer a regulating presence of conduct on trains, tube staff came to manage the gap between train and platform, while passengers were left to manage the gap between each other." And it's really interesting to think about that in the context of the recent transport strikes here in the UK, which revolved a great deal around staffing trains and staffing stations. And the sort of very complex politics of that Sim just really outlines so powerfully in this chapter. We go to a tea shop next, that fixture of the early 20th century London landscape, where we find a handsy reverend harassing poorly paid tea shop girls. And it's a chapter about capital, about labor, about desire, and the way that this was tactilely enacted, as Sim puts it. This chapter explores the way that touch opens up new intimate histories of global capitalism, and it also examines the way that tea shop girls, as part of a vast and growing feminized workforce in the service sector, experience the touch of others. Quote, touch that was unwanted, violent, and, because shockingly normalized, often unrecoverable by historians. It also explores the socially differentiated experiences of being a viable body, particularly at work, and just how blurry the lines between the intimate and supposedly non-intimate forms of labor can be. It examines the inequalities of touch, who gets to touch and be touched and in what way, and how complex the policing of these lines were. Touch both produced and was a product of T-Girl's work, and it shaped the whole ballet of the iconic London tea shop in both licit and illicit ways. And as I read this chapter, I found myself thinking about the eminent feminist historian who once told me at a meal following a seminar we'd both been at about how when she was younger, male historians would grab her thighs beneath the dinner table, how utterly normal that was back then. And at the end of this chapter, I started thinking about how touch has produced historians' labors as well. We find ourselves next in the sensory disorder of the London fog. And this chapter explores fog's sensory possibilities and dangers and the ways these were mitigated and understood in law. Who saw what? Who touched who? And how was this story then told in court? It contains one of the best ways I've ever heard fog described, and I've never seen a London fog, thankfully, because the air has been cleaned up, but I've seen many a Newfoundland fog, which is very thick. And Sim writes, quote, rather than merely occupying space or governing activity within it, fog engulfed it, making the bodily experience of being within space tangible. Through its sensorially disorienting effects, fog temporarily called attention to the streetgoer's fundamental but easily forgotten existence as a body in the world. And I don't know if I've ever read anything that describes how fog, the sort of uncanny, strange feeling that fog gives you than that. And so, the history of touch was also, in short, one of disability, scientific and legal reasoning, urban life, capitalism, and the potential for violence or tenderness at the heart of every embodied encounter. And I came out on the other side of this book convinced that touch is everything. And it's really quite strange because I'm seeing it everywhere now too. It really has made me profoundly aware of how sort of touch transpires in the everyday world that I am currently inhabiting. And this book unapologetically connects the reader with their present and as much as with their present as much as with these past touch worlds. The shadow in the room as I read this book on a screen is the current American and increasingly global political crisis, produced, as I think everyone would agree, at least in part, from the increasingly touch-free nature of our communications worlds, where avatars interact with avatars and the primary physical connection we feel is our fingers on the plastic of keyboards and our butts on the fabric of desk chairs. Sim ends with some questions that are of extreme importance today. How do we find our place in the world when it so often feels beyond us? These are his questions in his words. How do we reach one another, even while touch exposes our many differences? How do we stay open to others while still protecting ourselves? So those are immense questions, but it's very fair for him to ask them because it's an immense book. So congratulations, Sim, on a wonderful achievement that, like, when I say thought-provoking, I mean it in the profoundest sense. I have questions for you, but I don't know, do you want me to get right into them or do you want to reflect on some of my reflections first?
Oh, I think I mean the main firstly, thank you. Thank you for those fantastically generous comments. I think the thing that struck me first was about your last comment, especially about touch and authenticity. So how it's so significant for um enabling people to kind of verify the truthfulness of political discourse. So it's related to your first comment as well about reading the book online, and how actually there's such a need to be in space in order to actually verify, the truthfulness, I guess, of what people are saying. We lose that through a completely disembodied and virtual way of engaging with reading, but also with political discourse as well. So I'm afraid I haven't got anything, particularly insightful to say about it, but that was really what struck me, especially.
Yeah, that's the perfect way to put it. And as I was writing all of it, I thought, my instinct is to say, Julia, you're romanticizing the book, right? You're romanticizing the library, the physical. But this book really helped unlock for me some of the things I've been feeling about the current sort of world that we live in, and its increased disembodiedness, and why I've been feeling them actually, and why it matters, and how, yes, some of it is the romance of the library. They're romantic places, libraries. But it's actually something quite deeper than that. Yeah. So my first question, so you ask of the emerging science of touch, so Head et al., how did ways of conceptualizing touch, as situated or otherwise, themselves emerge from everyday tactile encounters? And so I'll ask you, what everyday tactile encounters led you to this project? How did you decide the size of it, its periodization? Yeah, how did you get here?
I've always I'm sure there's a kind of psychoanalytic reason for this that I've not probed properly. But I was reflecting on that recently and kind of thinking, so I guess I developed the idea for the project around about 2013. So I was in my early 20s, and I think I was still, not living in London then, but I was just visiting periodically. And I think visiting independently for the first time as someone in their early 20s, I saw the way that people interacted on night buses. I saw the kind of often strange interactions you see on the tube. Um, and it was invigorating for me. I think sometimes I felt lonely, but I think I also was aware of, I guess, how fraught touch could be in each of those domains. So, from a kind of personal perspective, I think that's where I was in my life at the time. And that really brought the question to the fore. But then I think historiographically, I also intuited that the way that historians and theorists had thought about not just touch, but I guess about interactions in the city, interpersonal interactions, often seemed a little bit flat and a little bit homogenous. And it didn't quite get at how perception and feeling comes about through individual situated experiences. So I guess kind of the idea comes from this double absence as a young person who's experiencing London independently, and I guess sees touch as both something that you need, but is also a threat, but also kind of intuiting this simplicity about how it had been written about, even in histories of the senses. So I guess the question is, well, I just feel like if you were reading Georg Simmel, he wouldn't be very useful for describing an interaction on a night bus or on the tube. If you're reading an urban sociologist, it's not a great description of, I think, the complexity of those relationships. So how could you write a story which was a bit more open-ended than you might get from a theorist? In terms of the framing, so there are historical and historiographical reasons. I think historically, so the book starts in the 1860s, and that's because that's where you begin to see the emergence of new urban spaces, which enable these different interactions to happen. So you see underground railways, for example, tea shops. The 1860s, 1870s is also when you see more scientific and medical interest in touch. So touch basically becomes an object of concern, particularly for people who are interested in the relationship between the body and the mind. So the study of touch becomes a way of studying how the mind and the body are connected. And then for people like Foucault and Kittler, they see the 1860s, 1870s as the start of the development of a subject that can be worked upon, a sensory subject that can be identified and worked upon. So that, I guess they're the historical and theoretical reasons for why it starts then. Why it ends in the 60s and 70s, I know that's a bit of a kind of odd, unusual ending. But I guess theoretically, that's because the book that is so influential for how I think about touch, so The Phenomenology of Perception by Merleau-Ponty, the first English translation of that comes out in the 60s. So in a way, that's kind of the end of the story in the conceptualization of touch from this very mechanistic understanding that develops in the 1860s to actually thinking about touch as something that comes about through our situated, embodied involvement in space. So for Merleau-Ponty, it's about what you do in space. So yeah, the 1960s seemed like a sensible time to end it for that reason.
I mean, you do have to end it somewhere, even though
But in some way,
clear
yeah. I mean,
you
the
could have
point
gone
is,
on.
like, you can't have a singular chronology of touch. They're actually just myriad chronologies.
Yeah, and I think that's opposite for sure. And it's funny because as I was reading, I kept thinking about how touch and the sort of rules of touch are one of the ways that a newcomer to a city comes to learn that city, right? They know how to avoid the press of crowds, and they know what surfaces to touch and what not to touch. So it's interesting that you kind of cite coming to London as one of the kind of places where you started thinking about these things. So I also want to ask you about some things that are not in the book. Not because they should be in the book. Definitely not, because there's only so much you can put in the book. Although this could have been much longer, because I kind of want to give you so many different case studies and say, put touch on this, please. But there's a few things that I was really curious about, and the first is that this is a very urban history. It's a history of a city, and it's very in very, very specific ways. The city is not just a passive backdrop here in the slightest. But what might we say about touch in other spaces? So touch in rural spaces and smaller spaces and even domestic spaces.
Yeah, so that's it's a blind spot, I guess, isn't it? I mean, the weird thing is, I grew up in rural Gloucestershire, and I spent a lot of my upbringing in playing in the fields. So in a way, it doesn't relate to my personal experience. But I guess I chose cities because cities of a certain size engender these particular environments and spaces. So fog, for example, urban smog is because of the pollution. In terms of the kinds of touch that might exist in smaller spaces or rural spaces, I guess I think first about like rural industry. So mining, forestry, weaving, where there's still a really embodied element, even when those mechanize as well. So I guess rural industry is the first thing, but then you can broaden it out even more to think about all the different phenomenological aspects of rural life. So, these are kind of terms that you could use. So do you know the anthropologist Tim Ingold? Yeah. So Tim Ingold, right? So, he used these big categories like building, making, wayfinding. So they're all categories that you could use to think about a history of touch or a phenomenological approach to life in rural areas as well. So it's definitely missed out, but that would be a whole bunch of other cool stuff to do.
Yeah, I think it would be deeply unfair to say it was missed out. Yeah, it's more so just another direction that you're pointing to for future studies by you or by others. I also found myself thinking about touch and the more than human world, and those sorts of questions. And not that, there aren't more than human worlds within cities, but they do seem more immediately available and touchable outside of them. So the other question about something that's not really in the book, and perhaps I suspect that you, in some ways, deliberately avoided this context, even though it must have been on your mind as you wrote it, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I did find myself thinking, I really would like to hear Sim talk a little bit about touch and disease, and touch as transmission, and touch as infection, and perhaps why you didn't engage with it, or how you might engage with it now.
So the pandemic's an interesting one because yeah, as you say, I was writing the introduction during the lockdowns, and I agonized, I guess, about whether to include it or not. Um, and the pandemic is interesting because as we all experienced firsthand, right, with the lockdowns and with social distancing, it's a kind of phenomenological disruption. So you suddenly become aware of all the things you take for granted, not just socially, but with your bodily experience as well. So you come to miss the touch that you don't have, right? Um, so in a way, it's kind of, you could say it's the ideal case to end the book. But I also felt that actually what it did was accentuate the deeper and longer reality of what touch is. So the fact that we all long for touch, but also that there's a fear of touch as well, that the touch is dangerous. So in that sense, you could see the pandemic, it seems like it's a sharp rupture, but at the same time, it actually reveals a continuity, something which is more deeply the case. So in a way, talking about the pandemic kind of distracts. But then, so that's what I guess what happens if you think about the pandemic as a one-off. But then if you say we're living in an era of pandemics, so this is like Anthony Fauci's kind of argument, right? There will be another one soon. Then maybe we should start saying that actually there is a fundamentally different embodied experience which continues afterwards. So I think if you think about pandemics not as one-off events but as an era, then you can start talking about a big embodied disruption. But individually, I think I couldn't. I think I'd also say, just kind of personally, I felt like it was obviously it was obviously painful writing this during the pandemic and being aware of missing the touch that I wanted. I think what it did make me aware of even more so was the importance of touch for our psychological well-being as well. And there's a lot in the book which is about violence and inequality and the way inequalities kind of produce violence through touch. But I think the pandemic helped me to realize its importance for, I guess, to make sure that it doesn't overshadow the positive elements of touch as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's the value that we put on touch that makes it so potentially violent and so potentially dangerous, right? If touch didn't matter, then it wouldn't be a threat. Um, and yeah, I found myself thinking as I was reading, especially in the latter bits of the book, I found myself thinking about how people became really obsessed with hand washing and not touching surfaces, and even long after the evidence was clear that it was an airborne infection mostly. And I just thought, what does that say about what we've come to think that we can control within kind of modern urban life? Like, as long as we don't touch anything, we'll be okay. I found it really striking. So last question before I turn it over to this absolutely lovely bunch of humans that I'm seeing the names of on the screens. So obviously it's a question that's drawn from my own research about intimate labor, and I found myself wondering how you would answer these questions. Is touch always intimate? And in what ways might your framing of intimate in this book unlock a new way of thinking about intimate labor as touch work? So, intimate labor and emotional labor are pretty commonly bandied about these days, but touch work isn't. And I found myself thinking, what work might touch work as an idea do? And lastly, and it's in some ways the biggest question, how are you using and conceiving of the concept of intimate here?
Just a small question. Okay. Yeah, intimate labor. So yes, so I write particularly about emotional labor, right? So about waitressing, uh, massage and physiotherapy. And I guess while the book is emphasizing the kind of the threatening side of bodily vulnerability, there's more, I guess, that it can bring out about vulnerabilities, the condition of care, because that's the nature of vulnerability, right? Is always being open to the other. That can be a threat, but also this enables you to be cared by others. So that's why care work, I guess, for anyone, but particularly infants, people who are ill, older people, is often about touch. So it is a form of touch work. I guess it's also about how you think about the skin. So, there's that great book on the skin by um, Didier Onzier, which thinks about the skin as it's an envelope of the body, but it's also an envelope of the psyche. So actually, in care work, using touch can be a way of kind of improving people's psychological well-being as well. So I like the idea of emphasizing touch more than maybe the affective elements of care work. Um, in terms of intimacy, okay, so intimacy in a couple of different ways. So intimacy as a method. So to think intimately is to engage closely with a topic, which as a historian, I guess, means doing thick descriptions. And it also means the way you're reading your sources to pick up the incidental. As a topic, I guess intimacy is obviously about physical proximity and it's about personal matters, which I guess is why I'm focusing mostly on interpersonal behavior. I think subconsciously, the thing I was interested in was tacit assumptions, codes, and rules by which we physically relate to others and interpret our embodied experience. So it's a kind of, if you want to use Benjamin wrote about the optical unconscious. So I was interested in the tactile unconscious. What's all the hidden stuff that governs the way we interrelate with one another physically? So I think that's probably why I'm missing other forms of touch, or I don't really discuss them so much. So you could think about professional touch, which may or may not be intimate. So the touch of a doctor, for example, or you could think about mediated touch. So you talk about haptics. But I thought that for me, intimacy was the best way of understanding how what we do with our bodies in particular spaces shapes what we're able to perceive and think and feel. So that's, I guess, what I mean by like this tactile unconscious.
And there's a lovely parallel there too between your method and then that definition you just gave that, reading intimately allows you to see in new ways as well. I wrote down the sort of the thing about reading your sources to pick up the incidental, because I think that's a really good way to put it. But enough of me. because there's already lots of questions coming up in the chat, and I'm going to take a step back and just listen to the conversation from here. Thank you very much again, Sim. It was a wonderful thing to read and think with.
Thanks for these as well. It's so good to continue the process of thinking. So thank you.
All right, so thank you, Julia, and thanks, Sim. So we're going to open it up for questions. We do have some in the chat already. I will go through some of those. Also, if you have a question, you can feel free to sort of raise your Zoom hand, so you'll jump up, and then we can sort of go back and forth. But I'll start it off. You've got a question comment from Barbara Taylor. She says, I wonder if Sim knows Poppy Sabag Montefiore's, apologies about the name if I've butchered that, a wonderful essay on touch in China that was published in Granta some years ago. And that Gabriel Josephovici's book has been valuable to me in my own thinking about touch. And so then next up, we've got a question from Dave Fogg Postles, who says, could you bring out anything about class and touch, distance and closeness, etiquette and propriety?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I don't know that essay about touch in China, but that sounds fantastic. So thank you for that. I do know the book by Joseph Avici because that's particularly, I think it's about literary representations of touch in particular, I think. But it's also very elusive. It's just wonderfully kind of open-ended. So I would certainly recommend that. I'll go and find it from the bookshelf to show you afterwards. But yeah, so Jos Pavici's book on touch is great. Class and touch. Pretty much all of these interactions are mediated by class differences. So this, I guess, is a history of space as well and spatial segregations of class. So if you think about the underground, for example, when it opens in the 1860s, the carriages are divided by class. Not that it makes that much difference when it's busy, but ostensibly people sit by class, and there are also women's only carriages. When the underground is electrified from the 1900s on, you see the introduction of classless carriages. And this is what makes touch such a kind of fraught issue on the tube, is because there's a much more mixing of genders and classes within these ostensibly democratic spaces. So I guess the history of spatial segregation in the city is also what's changing these kind of classed elements of touch too. I suppose it's also, I mean, you could also even you could write a whole essay on gloves as well. So the way in which gloves are used as a form of social distinction for, you know, the upper middling class. A similar argument, I guess, you could make about tea shops. So tea shops, there's a huge variation in them. I mean, you get very small, cheap ones like the ABC, which you'll just find on Oxford Street. And these are quite, I guess you'd see mostly upper working class, lower middling class going to the ABC. But then if you start going to Lions, and you go to the gigantic corner houses of Lions, these are ostensibly more democratic spaces, so you get a bit more of a mixing of classes. But even so, within the Lions corner houses, there are quite distinct areas. So the area with the orchestra and the Palm House is very different from the kind of basement tea shop. So some of these spaces are kind of internally class divided as well. So anyway, it's a long answer, but in summary, I'd say look to the history of space in order to tell the history of class and touch.
Excellent, thank you. I will switch it up for 1 second. And Ren Pepitone, you have a question you want to go ahead and ask?
Sure. Hi, Sim. It's great to see you. Congratulations on this book. We read it in the fall. It's really impressive. The question that I have, I think I don't want to steal Ruby's question that I see in the chat, but it's quite similar. I think something that really struck me about this, especially being a first book, is the fact that unlike many first books, which kind of identify an archive and then build a history out of that, you've chosen really discrete case studies. And I think that works really nicely for your overall argument, but it's also in some ways quite brave. So Ruby's question is asking about how you picked the case studies, and I was had questions along that line as well. But then I also was really curious about some of the theoretical commitments underscoring the book. It's been a minute since I've read something using Merleau-Ponty, for example. And so I was curious if you came into the project with Ponty, for example, as someone that you knew you were going to be using to kind of build a theoretical framework for the work that you were doing, or if that emerged over time as you were doing the project. So yeah, kind of both how you selected your case studies, but also how you selected the theoretical framework that you were approaching the book with.
Good questions, thank you. Yeah, the case studies. So I really wanted this. I wanted to show what a history of touch could do for other histories, how it was important to other historians who might not be sensory historians. So each of the case studies looks at a different domain of knowledge and a different historiography, which retrospectively was a crazy idea and exhausting. But it means that you can show how historicizing conceptions and experiences of the body changes the way that we think about how law is made, how scientific reasoning is developed, how disability as a concept is formulated over the 20th century. So each of them becomes an intervention in a field of knowledge and historiography. In terms of how I found the case studies, a lot of that was actually just, I kind of worked out the domain that I wanted to work with. And then I sat in an archive and called up for weeks and weeks sources that might give me the kind of density of material that would allow me to tell the stories that I wanted to tell, right? They're kind of very thick descriptions. So, for example, the tube case, the tube chapter is built around this murder of the Polish Countess Teresa Lubienska. But it's only because I sat in the National Archives for about 3 weeks and called up loads of MIPO files that I came across this case. So a lot of it, I guess, was quite, once I'd chosen the area, it became quite random also, almost, or arbitrary. But I particularly wanted it to be following the subject. So to do an ethnography where you identify a subject like Lubienska, and then you follow her life through the spaces that she occupied in order to show how the understanding of touch changed over time. So it's a little bit like a kind of Latourian study of science, right? Where you're looking at all the totally mundane things that people do in the lab, because that's how knowledge is built. And so you do that for touch, but you look at the spaces where people are touching. In terms of theoretical commitments, yeah, you've kind of rumbled me that so Merleau-Ponty, I read from the beginning because I knew he was significant, but I didn't really know what to do with him. And I didn't know what the context was of, who he was speaking to. So I kind of labored reading him while doing the empirical work. But I think towards the end, as I was reflecting on what I had done, and also especially having done more recent reading in theories of the embodied mind, so contemporary neuroscience, actually, the theory of embodied mind is rooted in Merleau-Ponty's work, even though it takes it in much more extreme directions. So I then returned to Merleau-Ponty and then found, amazingly, that he cites Henry Head. He cites Head's main article from 1911. So I realized, not through intention, but actually what the story was is a kind of archaeology of the history of the embodied mind as an idea that actually starts not with Husserl, but with Henry Head. So it was like an absolute gold moment to me to realize that actually this major work in mid 20th century phenomenology actually had the idea of the body schema comes from British neurology in the early 20th century. So I think I'd say he became more important as the project went on.
Great, thank you. And Ruby, I think that handles your question also, but feel free to throw another message in there or pipe up if you have any follow-ups. We have another question from Barbara Taylor that says it's an impossibly large question about race and touch. In the Jim Crow South, for example, even an accidental touch of a white woman by a black man could be disastrous for him. See Nickel Boys and many other sources.
Yeah, that is a huge question. I mean, if you look at, Mark Smith's book on race and touch is the one to go to. There are also lots of physiological experiments done in the late 19th century where racial distinctions in touch are assumed as well in the experiments in America. So there's a little bit of race, I guess, in the story that I tell about the tube. So some of the subjects there are young black men who've just migrated to London. And so the erotic encounters that they have on the tube have a very different charge, a different kind of inflection. But just like class, it's a dimension which is shaping all tactile interactions. It's both a major object of inquiry in physiology, but it's also shaping every single tactile inquiry, every single tactile encounter in London as well.
Okay. Quick follow-up from Ruby. Do you theorize a difference between touch and violence? Are those distinct, a continuum, or?
Good question. Does something become violent when it's perceived as a transgression? And is something perceived as a transgression dependent on what your sense of self is? So if we assume that we think of our bodies as always autonomous and as some forms of touch as transgressing our autonomy, then that touch is violent. But I think if we have an attenuated, or we lack a sense of autonomy, then is it still experienced or understood as violence in the same way? So I don't know if this is an answer to the question, but I think to determine whether something is violent or experienced as violent, perhaps we have to look at the history of the self as a bounded subject, because that will really shape whether it's considered as an embodied experience to be violent or not. But every touch has the potential to be violent.
Great, thank you. Do we have any other questions from anyone? You can either put them in the chat or raise your Zoom hand.
I just had another thing to say about race. So there's a great book called The Habits of Racism, which is based on a little bit on Fanon's writings, because Fanon has one of his chapters opens with his description of being racialized and feeling that in an embodied way. So the habits of racism kind of develops that argument to think about how racism takes an embodied form and is something which is felt in an embodied way as well. So I'd really recommend that. And also, obviously, go back and read Fanon.
So we got a somewhat follow-up from Dave Postles. Does this fit with Mill and self-regarding and other regarding actions?
Well, we might need to expand on that a bit.
Yeah. Dave, do you want to expand on that question at all? Maybe, maybe not. And while we wait, also, if there's any other, oh, he said no. Okay.
I'm not so hang on, let me see if I can read it. Well, I can't give a good answer to that.
No worries. Any other questions? Or Julia, if you want to take a moment to also follow up with some of yours.
One of my reflections is this is like teaching in April 2020 with all the cameras off and not knowing who's out there. Who are we touching? Who can say? Hi, guy. No, I think I'm happy to leave people. Hello. I'm happy to leave people to think a little bit more about questions because I'm sure there are some. Or not. I do have one. I had a question that I left off my sort of omnibus question list, which was about age. You kind of touched on it a little bit when in your answer about care work. But I did wonder, because that could have been one of the places you went more firmly, is this idea of age and children and older people is more touched, and certainly in the case of children, more touchable and more touching. And I just wonder, like, I know you do talk about this quite a lot. You talk about children quite a lot in your chapter on blind children. But did you think in other ways about age as one of the ways in which this is sort of cut through?
Yeah, I think when I'd very early in the project, I'd read stuff on touch and child development. So the psychological importance of touch from early infanthood, right? So I think that would have been that would definitely be a whole new chapter. What I've seen less of is touch for older people, so touch in the kind of care context, or like romantic touch for older people as well. But I think that's maybe one of the blind spots of the kinds of interaction that I'm looking at, because you're thinking about generally pretty mobile, economically independent people in an urban setting. So you don't always get that age dimension. But yeah, I suppose it's particularly through. But the stuff on blind children is not really about it's not so much about their cognitive development. It's about developing their ability to perceive the world in a way that's comparable to sighted children, allegedly in order to make them more kind of politically involved individuals. So it's like a political dimension rather than the cognitive dimension for child development.
Yeah, and I was thinking, as I was reading and, the Liverpool Street and what you just said about like, this is a sort of slice of humanity that are mobile, that are urban, that are professionals, that are adult. And it's way too simplistic to think like this, but at the same time, there's something intriguing about the idea that our life courses tend to take us from places where we're kind of touched and handled as children to a world where we're meant to very carefully manage who we touch and who touches us, to the end of our lives, where often decisions about who touches us and who we touch are again taken out of our hands. And so I was really, I thought, again, not just another chapter, a whole other book, but really interesting nonetheless.
But I think you're right. That is the story about changes in responsibility over an individual life. So it's not, you don't just see a historical change in what kinds of touch are appropriate, but there are biographical changes as well.
And then Barbara, did you want to go ahead and ask a question?
Unmute. Is there time just for a very quick one? First of all, I just want to say this has been a fantastic discussion, and I'm really looking forward to reading this book. So thank you very much for that. And then I just wanted to say that the context in which I've thought about all of this is solitude and loneliness, and the relationship between touch. I mean, when the way you talked about the kind of, how much the question of violence depends on the boundaries of the self, and that, and the whole question about what it means to be alone, to be solitary, and so on. I mean, there is no straightforward answer to that. So it intersects so deeply with the issues that you've been raising. I mean, the phenomenology of solitude is rich and complicated in so many ways that overlap with your work. So I am really looking forward to reading this book.
Thank you. That's very kind. I think related to solitude, I think psychologists talk about touch hunger.
Yeah.
And how, I guess, in a world where touch is increasingly, I feel increasingly fraught and regulated, then touch hunger is the psychological downside of that, the consequence. And that's why it's so important, I think, to try and maintain that balance between emphasizing the constant threat and risk of touch, which is inflected according to our different gender and race identities, but not to lose the other side of what it means to be tender, right? To be to be able to give, to be able to care, to be able to be gentle, and in the public discourse about touch, that's lost. I feel like it's we easily lose that. So yeah, touch hunger is a real problem.
All right, and with that, I think we are just about at time. I just want to take this opportunity to thank you both, Sim and Julia, for joining us today. This was a wonderful conversation, and I hope that everyone will join me in thanking both of our guests. For those who attended, keep an eye on our schedule, and hopefully we'll see you all back at another event. But for right now, thank you very much to Sim and to Julia.
Thanks for joining. Thank you, Julia, for wonderful questions, and thank you everyone else for yours as well. It's just, it really helps to keep thinking about it. So I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.